The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us in this webinar. This will focus on managing water scarcity, lessons from Cape Town. As we all know that Cape Town has emerged as a very hotbed of managing waters, particularly in the urban cities. But deep down, it's a question of adjusting to different tiers of governance at the city level, at the state level, and at the country level. But also, it's a climate change challenge. How to manage water scarcity, droughts, and floods in the urban settings. It's also a question of equity and fairness, how the water is distributed to different stakeholders, how the pricing structures um, incentivize conservation and efficiency of water usage. Um, this is an issue of extreme importance, not only for Cape Town, and we wish to take this opportunity to show our empathy to the citizens of Cape Town who are undergoing very severe rationing. And at the same time, I want to share with you that many cities across the world share water scarcity because of droughts and poor water management. It's not the first time a city is facing this kind of rationing, even though day zero was very, very dramatic. Fortunately, it's pushed from April 11th to a subsequent date, perhaps next year. Um, This is very important also because the cities were custodians of civilization. In last 250, 300 years, our civilization, human civilization and progress was made possible by cities who served as custodians and engines of growth and development. And now they may be posing a serious challenge how this civilization goes forward. Deep down, the poor people who constitute in many cities around the world, almost half of urban population consume a very small percentage of water, as in Cape Town, barely less than 5%, even if the water efficiency level there is not very high. But then on the other hand, the consumption pattern of the rich can be extremely wasteful in terms of per capita usage. So it's a question of equity and distribution. Um, with these a few points, starting points, and I have several examples from across the world in my mind where the groundwater is depleting. New technology or technological innovations are making it easier and less expensive to extract groundwater, and it's happening ruthlessly, resulting in further depletion and contamination of groundwater. So how do we look at this issue? We have two speakers with us. Both have very important experience and insights to share with us. Our first speaker is from South Africa, based in Cape Town. Dr. David Lemaitre is the principal researcher at the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research based in Pretoria, South Africa. He has more than 30 years of experience in the ecology of various regions surrounding Cape Town. Although he focuses primarily on the management and policy, he recognizes that his work addresses social ecological systems and that solutions to many of environmental challenges lie in the social and economic domains as well as ecological ones. Dr. Lemaitre holds a PhD in plant ecology, specializing in invasion ecology and hydrology from the University of Cape Town. David, floor is yours. You have about 15-20 minutes. Participants will be able to see your slides if they're interested, and they can follow, and you can cross-reference to slide numbers so that they could go back and forth on different slides. And in the meanwhile, Ricardo, if any question or intervention comes to your mind, please feel free to raise a flag and we'll recognize you so that it could become a little bit more interactive. David, on to you.
Thank you. And hello, everybody. Yeah, I'm going to be talking a fair amount about the, if I want to call it the water resource management side of things. I will touch, though, on the political management side of things. But I think, in my honest opinion, much more of the problem around Cape Town has to do with the political management of things rather than the technical management of things. But let me go through and people can pick up as we go. Right, so I don't think you need to follow the heading. Let's go to the first slide. So South Africa has very progressive water laws. They're widely admired nationally, internationally, and nationally. And we underwent a major change after 1994 in moving from a water rights-based water management system to water being a shared property of all the citizens of the country, with the government as a custodian. But since then, we have faltered in actually taking what the law intended through to practice, which was essentially integrated water resource management. I'm not going to go into details why we have faltered, but it has had important consequences. So the law envisaged that the national government would be responsible for bulk water supply, large water schemes and so on, and local government would manage water services, actual delivery of water to its citizens, industries, and so on. And irrigation boards, now known as water user associations, would handle water allocation to irrigation to farmers. But unfortunately, in the 15 or so years since that law was enacted, we haven't made the kind of progress that we should have made, which has had consequences, and I'll come back to those. South Africa is also the 30th driest country in the world. Only 9% of our rainfall becomes runoff. We also have very variable rainfall and thus runoff, so that only about 26% of the amount of water in our rivers is actually available for use. In other words, can be on a long-term sustainable basis stored in dams and made available for use. Unfortunately, as a country, we have not lived like that. Water consumption figures vary a little bit, but basically they're around 225 liters per person per day versus about 173 liters worldwide. So we have not been consuming water like we live in a dry country, or one with very variable water supplies. We also know that 98% of the available water is allocated, and we've known that since the 1990s. If I now go to Cape Town, Cape Town is essentially a microcosm of South Africa. But we happen to be fortunate in some ways in that we are actually next to the sea, unlike our major economic hub of Gauteng, which is very far from the sea. Cape Town has developed its water supply system systematically since the early 1900s, when the municipalities that made up what is now Cape Town joined together to get funding so that they could develop one of the first interbasin transfer schemes in the country in the 1920s when they built the Steenbras Dam. I'll show you a figure just now which illustrates where some of these dams are. Since then, we've had an era of increasing engineering and technology solutions which have really been world-class. Other countries have admired the way that we've moved water around the country, and Cape Town is an example of that, with very large water schemes. There's been a lot of detailed planning and forecasting since the mid-1900s of Cape Town's water needs. And recent assessments beginning around the late 90s have also identified alternatives. Obviously, augmentation, increasing dam capacity is an option, but essentially all the really good dam sites have been used, so we don't have that as an option. Certainly not for large dams. We haven't been using as much groundwater as we could, so there's options for both conventional, in other words, typical shallow groundwater use, and also water use from a deep aquifer that is part of the Table Mountain sandstones that form our mountains. They've also considered reuse and desalination. So this diagram illustrates the current water supply scheme and how dependent Cape Town is on external sources. It doesn't actually show the fact that there are a couple of groundwater sources in Cape Town as well. But in effect, it boils down to only around about 2% of Cape Town's water supply is from local water sources. Everything else is drawn from other catchments, many of which the city itself has no management jurisdiction over. So it's heavily dependent on these interbasin transfer schemes. You can see the Steenbos Dam, or dams, which supply around 10% of the water. Teerwaterskloof Dam, which supplies around 30%. The Berg River Dam, the most recent dam in the system, supplies about 20%. The Vemershoek Dam, which was built around the Second World War, supplies about 14%, and the Voorvlei Dam and water supply scheme supply about 18%. So Cape Town is heavily dependent on these external water sources for its water security. And these water supply systems are shared with very large irrigation schemes. We have a large fruit growing and wine producing industry, which depend on the water, also depend on the water from this system. So let's look at, sorry, I'm just skipped here. Okay, so now let's look at some of the key factors that have led to us being in our current situation. Firstly, let's look at rainfall. So here is one of the features of the rainfall is that the rainfall is quite variable spatially. So this is the observatory is a gauge situated in Cape Town itself. The one called Tronk is one situated in Stellenbosch. And it doesn't seem from those rainfall gauges going through to 1960s that there seems to have been much of a decrease in the rainfall. But if we go to more long-term records and we go back to look specifically at the rainfall at the observatory, we can see that there is some evidence of an increasing number of dry years in the latter half of the record, with the 1800s having been actually relatively wet. But if we go to the next graph, we can see much more clearly. So this is 3 stations which are within the area that supplies the dams, and over the period from 1933 to 2017. And there you can see both a long-term trend and the rainfall, actual annual rainfall variability. And what we can see is that overall, over that time, we've actually been losing on average about 17 millimeters a decade. And I've highlighted with a red circle right at the end the last couple of years of rainfall, showing in fact that they have been very low.
David, can I ask you? I have a request to make. Can you make your presentation display on the full screen, if that's possible?
I am displayed on the full screen. Okay, I wonder how I can do this.
Okay, don't worry. Don't worry. If you can, then it's fine.
Can you manage to see it? Sorry about that. Yeah, I'm not quite sure how to change it. I think I'd have to go back and set the displays differently. Let me just see. Is that better? Right. Well, let me carry on anyway. So here's another graph which really shows the situation we're in over the last couple of years. So this is from the Cape Town Airport and shows the annual cumulative rainfall over the past years since 1980s. It's available on the web, and the web address is included in the notes underneath this. But what it shows is the very long-term average is that thin black line passing through that purple band. And well below that, in deep purple, you can see the 2017 rainfall. And you can also see where we are in 2018. So we have every sign so far that 2018 might be as dry as 2017. So clearly we are in a very dry period. This graph also, I've given the sources for this in the notes, shows that we are also, in terms of analyzing the drought and whether or not this is an exceptional drought, that actually this is about a 1 in 300 year drought that we're in. The confidence band on that 300 years is between 100 and 1,200 years. And I just want to note here that this essentially assumes stationarity. This analysis doesn't take any trends into account. It essentially assumes stationarity. We can also see that in the bigger picture of South Africa, Cape Town's drought is not particularly exceptional. Up to December 2017, the 12-month drought index was showing very dry conditions over the whole big part of the Western Cape province on the left-hand corner of South Africa. And this one shows the entire country, 36-month drought index, your standardized precipitation index for as in February 2018, and we can see that the Western Cape is by no means the only area of the country experiencing severe water problems. In fact, to the north of us, it is far worse because most of them don't have schemes with the capacity that Cape Town has. The other aspect that this brings to the fore, so now I've been talking about meteorological drought, now we can go and look at the hydrological drought. And I've selected an example of long-term stream flow. So this is from a site that's been measured for a very long time. It's in a high rainfall area in the mountains. The gray bars on this graph for each month show the stream flow, well, the bars show the stream flow in megaliters. And you can see the gray bars, which indicate the mean from 1961 to the current, and the black confidence limits, which indicate the 95% confidence interval. And what you can see is that 2015, 16, 17, and 2018, except for January, are all outside that confidence interval. In other words, pretty much all months. So in other words, we're having a substantial reduction in rainfall. What you can also see is that the reduction is coming in the form of a reduction in the autumn months, April, May, and March, and also in the spring months, September, October, November. We're seeing substantial reductions, so it's almost like we have a narrowing rainfall season. This is shown in another form in the next graph, where the gray dots show again the long-term average, and then the rainfall that we've had since then. So 2016 was actually, on this scale, a relatively wet year. 2017 was a drier year, along very close to 2015, and 2018 is not looking too good either. So we've not only had a change in the rainfall, but it has very clearly affected the amount of water that is probably going into our dams. Then we need to look at a different aspect now, and this is the sort of another component of the factors that have led to Cape Town's current water situation, and that is the water planning around the assurance of supply. We've got multiple projections, and these are typical of the kinds of projections that have been made since the 1960s for Cape Town's water supply, in understanding when to build new schemes and what kind of yield we should expect from those new schemes to meet population and demand. And on this graph, we can see the projections that have been made historically, and actually how Cape Town's water conservation is compared, and particularly how water demand management is actually reduced. So the actual trajectory of the water that we're using is actually considerably lower than any of those projected trends. So historically, Cape Town has actually been doing quite well at keeping down its water demand. We've certainly not been anywhere near the orange line, which indicates the unconstrained high water use that existed prior to 2004, projected forward on the base of population. So clearly Cape Town has actually done quite well at managing its water since the early 2000s. However, none of these analyses have allowed for climate change, or the area that I'm interested in, which is alien plant invasions. And they would actually have the effect of making the straight blue line in that graph, in the solid background to the graph, actually curve downwards, so that Cape Town can no longer rely on a supply of 600 million cubic meters per annum from its water supply scheme, but in fact will have to rely on a lot less. And that is simply because the rainfall is decreasing and the probability of droughts that we are currently experiencing, has been increasing. This map now shows some of the work I've been doing on alien plant invasions and their effect on the mean annual runoff in catchments that supply the water scheme. So this map shows the whole Western Cape, but I've highlighted with an arrow the key catchments that supply Cape Town. And what one can see there is that there's quite considerable reductions in the runoff in those catchments due to invasive alien plants. And that has not been factored into these historical analyses thus far. But we have done a brief analysis, which I'll talk about just now. So this is what it would have looked like in 2007. And this is what we project. If nothing is done about these alien plant invasions, which are typically pine trees invading our native shrublands and using more water, then the situation will certainly not improve. In fact, it'll get worse, even if we only project at 5%. So what do these invasions mean? Well, right now, these invasions can be summarized in this way. I'm not sure how familiar you are with this kind of a graph, but the bottom axis indicates how often you could expect your water supply scheme to not supply the amount of water that you expect it to. And the vertical axis indicates what that system's yield is. So in other words, if you're content to have 1 in every 50 years when your water supply scheme will have to be rationed, then you can get a certain amount of water out of the scheme. If you only want to have that happen once every 100 years, then you have to decrease the amount of water you take out on average. And what this graph shows that we're currently sitting where that blue dotted line is. In other words, the invasions have reduced the system yield from these schemes from the green line, which is where we would have been with no invasions, to the blue dotted line. If we continue not to do anything about invasions for the next 45 years, we will end up roughly where the red line is, with a very considerable reduction in the amount of water that can be obtained out of this water supply scheme. And that reduction would affect everybody, obviously, not just Cape Town, but also the irrigation schemes as well. So what are those impacts, in other words? So the negative impacts of invasive alien plants on yield are highly significant. The current production, we estimate, is around 38 million cubic meters per annum for the baselines, which is essentially the capacity of one of the important supply storage dams, or about 70 days supply at Cape Town's current use. If clearing of these species was not continued, it would rise to 130 million cubic meters per annum by 2045, which is the capacity of the third largest dam. We haven't looked at the data in detail, but we suspect that the impacts are likely to be greater than during droughts. In other words, right now, as a result of the drought, on an annual basis, Cape Town could be losing substantially more than 38 million cubic meters per annum. These were also not accounted for in the projections of Cape Town's water supply system. Now let's look at the third angle, which is population and consumption. Cape Town has been subject to intense immigration from other provinces in the country because we are relatively well off and there are opportunities for jobs. There may not be jobs, but there's opportunities and there's hope. And this has resulted in the immigration of millions of people to the Cape Town area over the past decade or two, but particularly initially in the 1970s, which is when people were allowed to move, black people were allowed to move to white areas more freely. But you can also see a big pickup around from about 2001 to 2011. There was another big jump in the population from around 3.7 million to over 4 million people, and it's now about 4.5 million people in Cape Town. And this graph shows that population increase over time. What it also shows is the cumulative dam capacity. So as we've added dams in the system and increased the capacity in the system, that is how the dam capacity has increased. But if we look at this in a slightly different way, we can see that actually, since about 1980, our per capita water storage capacity, in other words, how much water we have per person in the total water supply scheme, has in fact been decreasing. Despite the construction of new dams, the population increase has outdone that. And this is one of the contributing factors. As I said, Cape Town has rationed its water use, but this is one of the contributing factors to the steadily declining state of the water in our dams. This graph shows a series of lines which show how much water is stored in those dams in every week of the year. And you can see there's a progressive decline from the early 2000s, or 2009, 10, 11, 12, 13, through the recent years, where you can see the graph showing 2017 and 2018 and 2016, showing how Cape Town's water supply system has become more and more fraught. In other words, we've got less and less in reserves in the dam. I think it's probably important to mention here that one of the misinformations that Cape Town was fed was that our climate modelers predicted that in 2017 we would have normal rainfall, with the result that we were not rationed as strictly as we are being rationed now, and which partly explains why we've ended up where we are in 2017. Even though it was low rainfall, we hadn't yet adjusted our consumption enough. But we have been here before. In 2004, 2005, 2006, Cape Town also had low water capacities in its. Sorry, yes? If we look at that top box, which shows the period in 2001 to 2006, and then in the bottom graph shows how we've been doing in terms of our storage. And you can see this, the graph that I showed previously, summarized in a somewhat different form, but very clearly indicating the decrease. One of the features I want to draw your attention to, though, is note in previous years, particularly June 2014, and around August 2015, and June to August 2016, there was quite a steep rise in the amount of water in the dam. This reflects the fact that the rainfall, in fact, comes in April, May. We normally have quite good rain, heavier rain again in June and July, but because of the catchment requires time to get wetted up to the point that it really starts to generate runoff, there's a lag. But what you can see in 2017 is there was a similar lag, but also that there simply has not been the steep increase in runoff into those dams, implying that the catchment is actually progressively getting drier and taking more rainfall to wet it to the point where it actually fills the dams. So in summary then, I think Cape Town has been caught short by a combination of factors. Climatic factors are the declining rainfall and the severe drought. As I said, roughly 1 in 300 year drought. Supply assurance assessments that assume stationarity in inflows into the dams because they did not factor in climate change or invasion impacts. And then the second factor that has contributed is the rising population and consumption, where we don't have more big sites, so we haven't been able to increase the capacity much. And we've also seen an increase in irrigated agriculture in the Western Cape. So with all this, how has Cape Town responded? Well, I think we have shown, and I showed in that earlier graph, and this graph shows it again, how Cape Town has managed to keep its increase in consumption below projections, including for agriculture, as shown by the red line, which shows the urban historical and the urban projected, and the same for the agriculture, and obviously the total reflects that. The blue line shows the sum of the systems that are available and how much they're expected to yield. This line also shows, this graph also shows, this comes off the Cape Town's own site. It shows how much water they are actually producing. In other words, how much water is going through their water treatment system and being delivered into pipelines. And although we haven't reached the red dotted line, which indicates the desired level of water consumption in Cape Town, we have actually considerably reduced water consumption from peak of around 1,200 megalitres a day in January 2015, right down to below 600, and we're currently a little bit above 500 megalitres a day. So Cape Town and its citizens have responded by water rationing. So the severe water rationing introduced has had an effect. Not the complete desired effect, but it's had an effect. You can see that summarized in this graph as well, which shows with the dotted line how we're progressing against the planned usage. So we are above the planned, but we're well below the prior unrestricted 5-year average, which is shown by the grey graph. So I think Cape Town has responded, citizens of Cape Town and companies and industries in Cape Town have responded well. This is another aspect that's been done. So one of the schemes that the city has had is actually to put in water restriction system. So people have been cutting their use, and they've also had water restriction meters fitted. And this is the number of households who are well off and have been using more than 20,000 litres per household per month historically. And this is the number of them as it has been brought down. And currently the city is installing, I think it's around 2,500 more of these meters per month, and there are about 200,000 out already. So there's been a big effort by the city to curb high water users and bring them under control where they've not been prepared to regulate their water use. So from 1,200 million litres daily in February 2015 to 511 million litres daily in March 2018 is quite an impressive drop, particularly between February 2017 and February 2018. And this graph just shows that in a slightly different form, with the blue line reflecting how much water is being treated versus how much could have been treated as projected based on population. So I think Cape Town has put in a good effort. So we have rainfall that's apparently declining in line with predictions. In other words, it's non-stationarity. And that declining rainfall is both less cold fronts and less per front, which is the less cold front seems to account for the fact that we've had a big decline in our autumn and spring rain, which is when less of the cold fronts come through and they're driven further south by the high pressure areas over the country. The dam inflows are decreasing, which includes the impacts of invasive alien plants. Population is increasing steadily and rapidly, although we have been doing well with our water per capita. Competition with agriculture is increasing, and that is going to have a big economic knock-on for the Western Cape, because a very large part of our foreign exchange comes from the export of deciduous fruit and from wine and so on, and that requires a lot of water and has had to have some drastic cutbacks. The farmers in the main areas around Cape Town are currently operating on around half of their allocation, and further north, as I said, where it's even drier, they're down to 20% of their normal allocation, and they've been cutting out, abandoning orchards and cutting back orchards in a hope that they might get them to survive. So this is going to have a big economic knock-on, and the full effect of that we haven't seen yet. And another factor that has contributed is a failure to act timeously on reuse and alternative sources. So the city knew about the potential for using groundwater and has had a low-level exploration work done on and off over the past 10 years, but we could have established groundwater schemes in that time and had a very good idea of how much water we can abstract from them without having adverse environmental consequences from that abstraction. But one of the features that has played here is the issue of political timeframes versus long-term investment. So this would have required the expenditure of large amounts of money by the city in investing in these schemes, and these were not popular politically because the politicians always wanted to be seen to be cutting taxes, to be saving money, etc. And so there's a conflict there between what we've needed to do and what the politics have tended to dictate. So Cape Town has cut back. We made some unwise political moves, in my opinion. The particular one that was mentioned earlier was day zero. It was never zero in actual fact. What it meant was it's actually when the taps get turned off and you would have to go and get water from tankers that will be filled by the reservoir systems. There would still be water in the dams, there would be water available, but you would have to fetch it yourself. It would no longer be supplied to the individual household. We've also made unwise decisions around emergency drilling for groundwater, investment in very expensive desalination systems, where a longer term view would have developed less expensive systems, means more to scale and perhaps with better technologies. For the future, my concern is whether Cape Town's leadership can take the long view, and also whether our national government, which is responsible for bulk water supply, will take this long view, which is essentially that Cape Town is going to have to do more with less. We're going to have less water from our dams. If we have less water from our dams, we're also going to have less groundwater available. So we're going to have to look a lot more intensely at recycling and desalination. At the moment, Cape Town recycles something of the order of a few % of its water supply. And clearly we can improve on that. And then I think the third thing we're going to have to look at is what I would call ecosystem-based adaptation to climate change. We're going to need to face up to the fact that our climate is changing. It is affecting our water security. And we need to manage our catchments and ensure that the way that we manage our land use maximizes the benefits that we get out of our water supplies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. It's very insightful and very brief presentation based on long view and some scientific data. And we are particularly noteful of the presentations, the recommendations that you have made. We have received some questions from the participants as well. I'll read those questions, but before I come to that, I wanted to invite our colleague from Malawi, Dr. Sosten Chiota, to raise the first question with you. Sosten, can you hear us? No. Sosten, are you there? Otherwise, you may question. I think Sosten has left us or disconnected for now. A question that one of the participants, Khadija, has asked, that the 2017 rainfall prediction was made by whom? It was referred to in your presentation. It's a clarification question. David, did you hear my question?
Hello, can you hear me? I'll just repeat that. The projection was made by our weather service, which is the only organization allowed in terms of the law to make such projections.
And the second question that I have in front of me is that your argument was that it's less of a technical and more of a political issue. And the question I have in front is, what should politicians do for future consumption of water supply and production, and particularly in the context of 3 tiers of governance that South Africa has: the city administrators, the state, and the government, the state government.
Yes. As I said, my position or my view is that they need to take this long view, and they need to make the necessary investments. A lot of the investments around recycling and water reuse and desalination. Desalination is a bit more of a question, but certainly investments in recycling and reuse would be essentially up to the city. In South Africa, the provinces have no role to play in water supply and securing water supply. In terms of our constitution, the organizations that should be seeing to that are known as catchment management agencies. And there are a couple of catchment management agencies established in Cape Town's catchments, but they have very little executive authority or power. That still sits with the national department, and there's still a lot of political toing and froing and issues at that level that need to be resolved if we're going to actually enable water management to happen at a level somewhere between local government and national government. The national department, in fact, recently proposed that South Africa would have only one catchment management agency, which is then excuse me, supposed to interface with the water supply requirements of users on the ground, which is clearly not practical, and we don't know what the details behind that are, but it's not a decision that we think is a wise one.
Okay, thanks. It's a very good answer. I'm sorry, Sosten was muted earlier. Sosten, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead. You have a question to David.
and David, thanks for a wonderful presentation. I wanted to ask you, one of the issues you mentioned regards the fact that the water supply entity does not have the management of the catchment, and that is management might.
Sorry, can you speak up a bit? I can't quite hear you.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I wanted to ask you in relation to catchment management, where you suggested that the jurisdiction might be outside the supplier, the entity that supplies the water. So the question is, how do we resolve this issue? And I was wondering whether there is any regional mechanism for matching the catchment management and the and water supply for domestic and irrigation, because I'm only aware of like the water basin authorities and for the lakes and the rivers, but not in relation to domestic water supply.
Okay, if I understand your question right, basically the national department and, to my mind, catchment agencies should be those who are dealing with how water gets shared and how additional water is made available at the bulk water supply level. The local authorities are responsible for water supply at the municipal level, so they deal with water essentially from the bulk water level down. Does that answer your question? So, sorry, can't quite hear you.
I said, I suppose you have already answered. Unless you wish to elaborate, we can move to the second question.
Is Shostan happy with that answer? Maybe we can take it offline and he can email me and I can email him back.
Yes. Shostan, can you type your question?
But we can have further conversation.
Shostan, I'm afraid we can't hear you. You'll have to type your question. And let me go to the second question I have in the meanwhile. From Water Scarcity, it is important to consider governance a difficult issue since external sources are central to supply and we need mechanism to cooperation. So it's a comment about the governance issue that they're harder to manage. Any reaction to this? In other words, the technical solutions may offer some technical approaches may offer some solutions, but political and governance issues are more complex and sticky. In this situation, what are the prospects of addressing this crisis in Cape Town?
I think the prospects are reasonable. It's difficult to say at this stage. As a result of our recent change of president, our then Minister of Water Affairs, Water and Sanitation, was replaced by a new minister. So I would suspect there's a lot of, the new minister needs to get acquainted with the situation and so on before decisions can be made. But it seemed to me that there was a bit more of a cooperation between the different government levels in trying to address the situation. One of the problems that has bedeviled water management in the country is the fact that actually you can't manage water if you don't have some say over what happens on the land. But because of jurisdictional issues, departments have been reluctant to actually take each other on, as it were, and say, but we disagree, or we, and so on. So I think the negotiations have been difficult because departments are intensely aware that they manage the water while someone else manages the land. It's only at local government level where this comes together to quite a degree, where local government is seen as managing both land use and water and a whole range of other things, whereas that's all split amongst different departments at both the state or province level and the national level. And that's also not helped with managing water. Also, what doesn't help is the Catchment Management Agency would provide the logical connection between Cape Town and its water supply catchments. Cape Town has no legal authority over its water supply catchments because they fall, most of them, because they fall outside the metropolitan boundary.
I see.
Which means that you've got to have mechanisms like either at the state level or through a catchment management agency to make that work. And catchment management agencies, as I said, are still finding their way and are still establishing themselves and don't necessarily have the executive authority to do things.
Okay, David, I have a question from one Mr. Zahad Aziz asking us, would you please expand on the methods followed in case of desalination?
I'm not an expert on that, but what I believe is that the city basically put out tenders for relatively small desalination systems, a number of them. And the result was that not only were those systems expensive, the cost per megaliter of water delivered was also high. Whereas maybe if some more planning had been put into it and there was less urgency, they might rather have favored going for much larger schemes that will be around more permanently and building them in a phased fashion. But I'm not an expert on that. I just know that from what colleagues have said that they seem to have got some very high cost schemes being constructed because they didn't necessarily do all the, really sit down and think this thing through properly.
Fair enough, fair enough. David, I have one more question before I go to Ricardo. The question is from Ms. Sarah Hasnan, who's asking you how healthy or polluted are Cape Town's groundwater sources? What are the policies in place that are regulating groundwater usage in Cape Town? For example, in Karachi, private citizens do use groundwater resources, but it is largely unregulated. And now,
yes,
I just wanted to add to this question, now because of solar pumping, the rate of depletion of groundwater is also intensifying, which is deepening the water crisis in many major cities of Pakistan.
Okay, so, Cape Town, right. A large part of Cape Town sits in a large aquifer known as the Cape Flats Aquifer. Historically, for whatever reason, it was not exploited for water supply and it has not been well protected. I gather from colleagues of mine who are geohydrologists that a lot of the water is actually still in quite good condition and could be used, and it is one of the sources that is being looked at now. But there are parts of that aquifer that have been very badly affected by intensive agriculture and extensive informal urban settlements on them. But Cape Town is certainly looking at it. The deep aquifer supply would come from the mountain areas, which are pretty much pollution free, certainly from direct, they're not vulnerable to direct impacts because they're in remote areas and there aren't intensive activity. But the Cape Flats aquifer is very vulnerable. It's a deep sand aquifer, so it's a high vulnerability anyway in terms of the potential for contamination into it. And as I say, it does have these extensive areas. There is quite strict regulation, but it hasn't historically been applied. I think one of the big challenges, and maybe I should have emphasized that in my concluding remarks, I think one of the big challenges for Cape Town is Table Mountain itself and much of the Cape Peninsula is what's known nationally as a strategic water source area. It's part of the 8% of the country that produces half of all of our runoff. And Cape Town also sits in this Cape Flats aquifer. So to my mind, the challenge for Cape Town is really about protecting its water sources, protecting this Cape Flats aquifer in particular, and doing wise water management to maximize the amount of use that it gets out of the water that it has, including groundwater.
Okay,
there is potential, I believe, for managed recharge of the Cape Flats aquifer, but I'm not familiar with what's happening right now on that level.
David, you may like to answer one more question before we proceed. In terms of response in rationing or regulating water consumption, can you share with us the pricing structure, the cost for a few basic units that are essential for human consumption, and then going higher towards steeper price range towards luxury lifestyles? Any reflections and any mechanism that you can share with us?
You can find out information about this on Cape Town's. If you go to look at the city of Cape Town and you go to look at their water site, they've been putting more and more information on that site. The law in South Africa, the water law, the national water law, recognizes a basic human need as a fundamental water supply. It's been traditionally capped, I think it was originally at 25 litres a day. I don't know if they've ever increased that, but effectively it amounts to 6,000 litres a month for households, which is given to them free. Although it's treated water and all that, delivered via pipes, it is not charged for. Then the city also does have escalating water tariffs, and I believe they recently passed a new bylaw which enabled them to escalate those tariffs even more steeply. And as I said, they've also had this scheme of capping water use for households that seem to be unable to or unwilling to manage their water use. They've put in these capped meters. So the meters will supply a certain amount of water per month, and then they will cut off the supply.
David, I am tempted to move on, but new questions are trickling in. I'll read only two more questions in one go, and maybe you can combine the response. One question is from Matthew Suston, and that question is that sometimes reduced consumption does not necessarily mean water savings or good management, but no water supply to consumers for various reasons. How does the municipality check with consumption figures and what consumers actually experience? And if you allow me, I want to read the second question also. Please forget the following question only. There are important technical aspects of this question. Is not complete. I'm sorry. What is question? Are there differences in population response in terms of income average or location within the metropolitan area? This is a question from someone in Mexico, Boris Garisbord.
Okay. Firstly, just repeat that first question quickly.
Are there differences in population response in terms of income averages or location within the metropolitan area?
Maybe I can answer both questions at once. The city has instituted, and as far as I know, it's still up and running, but you can get to it through its water pages, basically a map of the city which maps out, I think it was down to the household level, but that got severe criticism, so I'm not sure it's still at the household level, but illustrates how water use varies over the city and highlights obviously then houses that have got high water consumption, presumably with the aim of getting social sanction in place. But water use typically varies in South Africa. We do have a few of our informal settlements where water supply is still to communal taps, and there are shared sanitation areas as well. From there, we typically progress to building initial what we call RDP houses for the Reconstruction and Development Program. So these are basic houses for people, which then are obviously supplied with water to taps in the house. And then we have all the way to extremely wealthy households who will have 10 bedrooms and 7 or 8 bathrooms en suite, at least one swimming pool in the garden. I think the response has varied quite a bit. Some areas, the high water consumption has been in the high income areas, but that's not always the case. It's sometimes been in some of the lower income areas. But it's not something I've looked at a lot, but we do have typical global patterns of consumption that when you have a shared tap and people have to carry the water, their water use is less than when they have a tap in the house. And then the more wealthy they are and the more washing machines, dishwashers, and swimming pools they can add, the more the water consumption obviously rises. But also at the wealthier end, people have been, till now, you only have to apply to the city council to get permission to put in a borehole. You don't actually have to go through a whole licensing process, which would be the normal process. So it's been essentially almost completely unregulated. And obviously the people who can afford to put boreholes in are the wealthier part of the population. There's also been quite a move to household grey water systems. So the water recycling at the household level, and also to rainwater tanks. But typically so far that's been mainly the wealthier people. But overall, as you said in your introduction at the beginning, the people at the bottom end of the scale, the informal settlements, account for very little of Cape Town's water use, around 5%, 4%, 5%. And they're quite a percentage of the population. Okay.
Thank you so very much, David. You have done an excellent job and excited our interest. And also, I hope you have enriched our understanding. There are many more questions, and we'll try to connect those with you. Allow me to go across the continent to Latin America, where a similar challenge is waiting for us in several other countries and cities. In Colombia, in Bolivia, in Peru, in Brazil. I was there only till yesterday for the World Water Council. Sao Paulo has a 100-year the worst crisis now in terms of drought. And I've come here into Pakistan where a similar water shortage in cities is experiencing. For this, to focus on the Latin American side, whether or not any lessons from Cape Town have any relevance for Latin America. We have with us Ricardo Sandoval. Ricardo, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you so very much.
Okay.
I know it's very, very early for you, 5 o'clock in the morning in Mexico City. Thank you
It's
for
6 o'clock.
braving us. And I particularly want to thank Boris Geresbot, who persuaded you to wake up so early in the morning. And I loved your answer. When I said, do you need a wake-up call? You said, we will be up, but rest of the world need to get a wake-up call that there's a very, very serious issue at hand. Boris, would you like to introduce Ricardo?
Well, I just want to thank Ricardo, not only for waking up early, but also for being able to participate in this interesting seminar. In fact, I enjoy very much David's presentation, and I think one of the main issues here is exactly what you, Ali, mentioned, the idea of learning from management scarcity in the Cape Town and the region in South Africa. So I think that will be an important issue that we have to work on that in the future. And I'm sure that Ricardo, being also a consultant for the Inter-American Development Bank, will put some experience in managing not only in Mexico but in Latin America. So I'm glad that we are joining this seminar, and I thank you, Ali, as well as Ricardo, to join us in this session.
Thank you, Boris. Ricardo, my request to you is to kindly share your presentation on the screen as you go. Try to make it on full screen if that's possible. And while you are doing it, I'm very happy to say that Ricardo has more than 25 years experience working with World Bank, KfW, AFD, IDB, just about all the usual suspects. A very well informed professional in the water sector. Ricardo, the floor is yours.
Can you see the presentation now?
Not yet.
I'm trying to. It should be. Well, can you see the presentation now or no?
Not as yet.
Mm. It says. Well, I don't know how to do it. It was working.
Ricardo, there is the option of sharing from where you can share your screen.
Just
Yes,
go. Just go at the top of your right hand.
Yes.
It says sharing. Go to sharing, and then the window will come down, and then you click on play, which says share.
Yes, I have done that, but something isn't working.
Okay, let's proceed in any case.
Indeed, my screen says I am showing my
Let's see, Ricardo, let's see if we can show the presentation from here while you can begin your presentation.
Okay. Well, I don't know if you have the presentation already.
I think we do. इनको email कर दो. Just a few minutes. Just a minute.
It's strange because it was working very well before.
Yeah, I know. There's always a glitch in technology. It happens exactly when you're not expecting it. Now, we can see it. I hope others can see it as well.
Well, I can see my own screen only.
Why?
Perhaps if you
how about now? Can you see it?
No, your screen, no. I see my own, but I don't know. Now I can see it.
Okay. So you just reference to slide number, and we'll go back and forth if you want us to. But floor is yours now. Apologies, everyone, for the delay.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really an honor to have this opportunity and a very interesting presentation from Cape Town. I was asked to give some general view of the situation in Latin America, so it is a little bit more general presentation, not so specific, but let's move on. So please, next. Well, this is the plan of the presentation. We have some very clear symptoms in the region that there is a generalized risk of falling into water supply shortages or crisis. we are experiencing now impacts of climate change in the region, and we are expecting to have major impacts, mainly in the bigger metropolitan areas. In this context, we are embarking on a very big effort to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and I want to make a reflection on what challenges are there for the region in terms of achieving these goals, and in the end, some reflections on the information and the things we have heard up to now about Cape Town crisis. Next, please. So the first point, as you were telling, there are some places in the region that are experiencing severe droughts. Colombia is experiencing the worst drought in history. Bolivia is also experiencing in half of its provinces a very acute drought. Peru is also facing a very complex situation, which has required the relocation or redistribution of water between 6,400 hectares of crops. In Brazil, you also mentioned, not only in Sao Paulo, but even in Brasilia, they are going through a very difficult situation in terms of water supply. So there is a generalized situation of, in Latin America of drought and water supply shortages, and it's getting apparently worse as time goes by. Next, please. So, given a general context, we have had also a very high growth in population from 1950 to 2030 is projected to grow from 167 million people in 1950 to 723 million in 2030, but also with an increase in the percentage of population in the urban settings. And in the other hand, with the inequality problem, where you have nearly 1 in every 4 people living in slums or in areas that have a very bad service in terms of water and sanitation services. So in the region, we have some countries with a very high mean natural water availability, but also we have a very big regions with low precipitation and runoff. For instance, like in Central America, in Mexico, in Peru, you usually have the bigger part of population and economic activities where you have less water. So it has become a very difficult problem to address in terms of water planning and management. We still have the majority of consumption for agriculture. We have a very big hydroelectricity production in the region that also poses a challenge in terms of when we have a drought, we have not only the water supply that is affected, but also the electricity production. And irrigation and water supply efficiencies are low. Wastewater treatment is also low. So we have a big challenges in terms of water services instead of having a relatively high rate of connection or coverage of connections, but without a very high level of services. So in the region, we have very different institutional frameworks. We have also, in general, a very low investment in water infrastructure in relationship with the size of the economies. The next, please. So there has been an evolution, if we can call it that way, from supply-oriented water policy towards going through a water and sanitation period where first in the region there was more interest in developing agricultural areas and hydroelectricity, and then water and sanitation. But in the recent years, there is higher recourse to non-structural measures, and there have been some legal reforms in the region trying to make a bigger effort in terms of institutional arrangements to cope with scarcity, with structural scarcity. But we could say we have a mixture of watersheds and countries with different development stages, and so with different policy approaches. At the same time, we are developing infrastructure. We are orienting some countries towards the supply oriented water policy, and the other countries are very advanced in the implementation of non-structural measures. We have some countries with centralized or national systems, with others with federal systems. So it's difficult to make a general characterization of Latin America as a whole. But we also have some successful, I would say, watershed, transboundary watershed management entities, and one in a very big aquifer in South America. And it has been said that it's common to have cooperation and even information sharing in this region more than in other regions in the world. But as I was telling you, you can find, for instance, in Mexico, a water policy system that has, in the one hand, a water rights administration system, and in the other hand, some participatory schemes. So there's something like a mixture of economic, institutional, and structural measures going on in the region. The next, please. So in terms of water supply and sanitation, we have, as we were saying, a high connection coverage, but also high losses, physical losses, and low levels of service. We have had many institutional reforms from the 1990s. Decentralized and regulated water utilities were proposed by the multilateral development banks. They were developed in the different ways by the countries. For instance, you have Chile, where you have a wider private sector participation schemes, and you have other countries where it didn't go that far. In the region, we have almost 47% of non-revenue water on average, and high energy costs. So we have clearly big challenges in terms of efficiency. Next, please. So we are facing impasse. I'm going more or less rapidly through this because I think we all know this kind of impasse throughout the world. Next, please. For instance, the global warming has been already studied for the region. We have identified the runoff changes that are expected in different scenarios. Next, please. And also in the right, you can see we are expecting an increasing meltdown of glaciers that is expected to affect very big metropolitan areas. Next, please. And we are already experiencing a growing damages and economic cost due to meteorological phenomena. Next, please. So if you see here, we can have the clarity that most of our most important metropolitan areas are located in high risk parts of the continent. So the question here is if we are prepared to cope with these changes, because some of them are being experienced as long-term challenges. I mean, in many cities we are reliant on groundwater to supply population, so that gives a false sense of security, since we are depleting aquifers, for instance, in Mexico City and other regions. But there are some other problems that we are going to face if we don't have the right preparation to face these changes. So in different parts of the continent, we are experiencing different risks. We are experiencing a growing frequency of hurricanes, and this is a general view of what we are facing right now. Next, please. So besides climate change, we have other triggers that are creating risks, like economic globalizations. For instance, the sudden growth in demand of specific goods provokes very rapid impacts on local aquifers and local watersheds. Also, the very rapid reallocation of economic activities is happening in the region. We have also cases of inequality, poverty, growing urbanization, and still some illegal and institutional shortcomings. But on the other hand, we have some opportunities. We are trying to look for financial diversification, for technology innovation. We have to we have to use our new technology for communication to raise awareness in the citizenship and raise participation. So there are risks, but there are also opportunities. Next, please. So if we want to talk about what we are trying to achieve, well, we have as a reference the Sustainable Development Goals. Next, please. I'm sure you all know that these goals, the goal number 6, that is related directly to water, but many other of these SDGs are also related to water, good water management. Next, please. So you know, I'm sure you know the targets. I can say these are very difficult targets to achieve. We are not only talking about water services coverage, but with sanitation, with improved water quality, with efficiency. Next, please. Within integrated water resources management framework, with ecosystem protection, and etc. No? So this is a very challenging goal that has been set. Next, please. In the other hand, we are talking in the region of a water security agenda, which is more or less the same that is being proposed for the SDGs. We are talking about providing supply, sanitation, with economic production in a way that respects environment and reduces risk of flooding and drafts. Next, please. But I wanted to show you this graph. Perhaps it's familiar for some of you because it was proposed by Professor Thornton and also. I guess it just shows the stages that we have crossed as a region, and many regions in the world, when you can go through, from a period where you have available water resources to a period where you have to use efficient water technologies, to the last period where you have to rely on more social and non-structural measures. What I try to say when I'm showing this graph is that in some parts of the region we are experiencing like setbacks, in terms that we are trying to solve the problems by increasing water supply. Let me tell you, for instance, we have different experiences here. I have had the chance to be part of the Lerma Chapala watershed basin negotiation. It is a watershed where you have a very intense use of water. And so from 1999, it exists a mechanism. So when you have a clear sign of a low runoff and low this availability of water in the system of dams, then a set of measures is being applied. So agricultural producers reduce their consumption, and you can balance the demand throughout the watershed. This is a good example of a non-structural measure that has been working well for nearly 20-25 years, with some periods of high conflictivity. But in the other hand, you have the problems like in the cities of Mexico City or Monterrey City in my country, where we are still trying to combine non-structural measures with a very limited efficiency with very big projects for importing water from other watersheds. But they are facing a huge opposition from local people who live in those parts. So I guess this is going to be the general situation throughout the region, where we are like moving towards a wiser and more advanced water management policy, but also with some people trying to push towards supply side solutions whenever the economy allows it. So it's not as easy as you can see in a graph where you have this progression, but it's also, we have regions in different stages of development, but also we have regions that are struggling to have an evolution towards a better water management policy. Next, please. So the challenges for the region are in one hand, the macroeconomic instability that we have faced in the past, and now we have we're living through a period where the countries in Latin America are experiencing reduced income because the changes in the markets of goods and services that the region provides to the world. We also have very big gaps in investment, in capital investment. We are investing very little in terms of what we should be investing. We have experienced a reduction in public finance in the last years. It was expected that the private sector participation would take part of bigger investments, but it has indeed remained the same. And in terms of institutional settings, we have also governance frameworks that are far from being effective in terms of producing well-functioning water utilities and irrigation units. Next, please. So we also have problems in terms of construction capacities. There is a huge infrastructure capacity in the region, but we still have a gap in terms of unequal access in different parts of the region, and also because some of the infrastructure is becoming outdated and should be replaced. We are also experiencing political changes that we have to say that politicization and trivialization of water management concepts arises. I think we are experiencing this in different parts of the world, meaning that some technical and economical solutions are being questioned since for the politics discourse, it is easier to propose like big categories, but not to get into concrete solutions. We have this very same problem that was shown for South Africa, that is the gap between long-term needs and short-term politics objectives. And in terms of human resources, we are also experiencing the weak incentives to attract younger generation. So we have very big challenges in the region. Next, please. And in terms of what has been proposed as SDGs, well, you can see that we are not talking about only access, improved access, but with quality access, we are having a very big gap to be covered with a very high financial effort. Next, please. The financial challenge has been shown to be like, I'm just telling you that we should have to invest like the double or 3 times what we have been investing in the last years, with very weak tariff structures. And so some strategies have been proposed. It has been proposed that wastewater should be looked as a resource, that we should develop green infrastructure for water and sanitation services, and we also strive for financial innovation mechanisms. But we should say here that we have also this problem that was mentioned in South Africa. Even when we know that a big part of the problem of water security goes through the improved control of land development, our water agencies are very limited in terms of their jurisdictional boundaries. And so we have to work much more with the ministries and with the governments in terms of the land use management, because there is a chance for instance, for green infrastructure development, but we have to get out from the traditional water sector to implement new schemes. Next, please. So we are talking about increasing coverage while simultaneously rehabilitating aging infrastructure. We're talking about dramatically increased investments and to rely more on demand management and better planning and regulation of services. Next, please. Also, it is very clear that if we don't improve our governance schemes, we are going to fall short in 2 ways. First, we are not going to be able to capture more financial resources, since grants and concessional loans are getting scarcer. So we throughout the world are going to go for financial resources that require a payback. But if our water utilities and if our irrigation systems are not capable of having stable and well-functioning financial systems, we are not going to be able to capture those private and financial resources. And in the other hand, if we don't improve our governance schemes, even if we achieve to develop infrastructure, we will not be able to conserve this infrastructure working properly. So we need also better governance schemes, better information and participation mechanisms, and we surely have a problem of integrity and accountability. Next, please. So there is a lot has been said about Cape Town. We are reading a lot about that, but we're not sure if what we read is real. We have had a very interesting presentation just now. Let me just share with you some of the things that we are hearing here. Some say that I think there's like a double vision here. Some say that there was an excessive reliance on water demand measures and a disregard on structural measures. This is like a high risk, because we have been struggling here in Latin America to convince governments to embark on new water policies that rely more on water demand measures. But when you find people that said that the mistake, so to say, in Cape Town was that the infrastructure was not built, we have the risk of giving arguments to those that are disregarding non-structural measures and asking for more dams and aqueducts to be built. Of course, we know we have to build more infrastructure, but also I found it very interesting to know that it wasn't that way that demand measures didn't work, but that what you experienced in Cape Town was a very unusual draft condition. So the other point is, are we considering risks adequately? That I think we share the same problem. It is not very easy to understand some concepts from hydrology related to uncertainty, risk, and probabilities. Decision makers usually want decisions easy to understand. We also perhaps have lack of social capacity to coordinate actions for rapid reaction. We are trying some new mechanisms. For instance, here in Mexico, we have a national program for dealing with drafts, and it has been implemented. I think it hasn't been tested yet, but an effort is being made to coordinate with the basin councils to implement progressive measures whenever a draft condition is detected. But it is still to be tested if we have this social capacity when we face conditions similar to that you are facing in Cape Town. And perhaps another interesting issue is that in the region we have had like many legal reforms in the last 20 years. But perhaps we should think that if we are relying too much on enactment of these legal reforms and not working too much in their effective enforcement. I mean, we should be most worried on correct measurement and controlling extractions and discharges, rather than having legal reforms one after another. And in the last but not least, we also face a similar problem with economic inequalities, which complicate surely the development of resilient water policies. Next, please. So there are some initiatives, I can tell you some of them that are being supported by the Inter-American Development Bank. For instance, green infrastructure, we have several water funds throughout the region where funds are being allocated to the preservation of watersheds. We have also programs for circular economy and increasing the support to wastewater treatment and reuse, which faces a challenge in terms of water administration, since treated wastewater is sometimes already committed with other users. We also are trying to improve and innovate in terms of financial sources, and to implement in the region economic regulation of water utilities. Some tools for better decision making are being implemented. In the picture you can see what IDB developed in Monterrey City. It's a space for the planning, the participatory planning in an immersive environment. It's a decision theater where, for instance, a robust decision-making plan was made for Monterrey City. So these kind of tools are perhaps useful to make it easier for decision makers to understand the issues that are being emerging with the climate change uncertainties. And also in the water utilities area, we are also putting more emphasis on performance improvement, like the implementation of a system for performance assessment. It's called Aqua Rating. Next, please. So, in conclusion, our main challenges are to face these regional seasonal variations with better administrative systems, not only relying on structural, but also with non-structural measures, promoting a legal framework which enable more agile and coordinated actions, achieving long-term participatory water management systems, promoting efficient water supply and sanitation models with better governance frameworks, reduce the gap between costs and revenues for water supply and management, and improve information and implement innovative decision mechanisms to cope with growing uncertainty and risks with an integrated approach. Next, please. So perhaps it was a very general view, but there are some specific experiences in the region that I'm sure we have many similarities and many things that we can, in the future, set up mechanisms to exchange with Cape Town and with the other fellows throughout the world, because this is a very urgent problem, and we could face similar crises throughout the region and very soon. Thank you very much. Can you hear me now?
Now,
Thank you. Thank you, Ricardo, for your excellent presentation and for making some very, very important points. There are several questions that I can see on the screen, but allow me to begin with a question that connects your presentation with David's. One of the points that David made was there is an emerging trade-off or a competition with the agricultural sector, such as the citrus and wine growing in the vicinity of Cape Town. For example, if you're rationing people to 50 liters in Cape Town, but then you are spending about a lot more water, perhaps 750 liters for a bottle of wine, then there's a trade-off in production of bottle of wine with consumption, human consumption. Equally true is about citrus, that also a mainstay of the economy around Cape Town. I know for sure, I've seen and visited the competition drinking water has in Mexico City with beer production. I know the competition that drinking water has with cotton production in Faisalabad city of Pakistan. So in the Latin American context, how do you see the economic growth will get skewed or distorted because of competing demand of water from different sectors? What's the competition there?
Yes, that is a very good question, because theoretically, for instance, here in Mexico, we have a system of water rights that would allow the different users to trade their rights and their long-term rights. So water is reallocated from one use to the other, but legally, nature is supposed to be protected in terms of the natural share of water that is needed to protect ecosystems. And then the water supply and sanitation, water supply is being protected, since water rights for human consumption are not transferable to other users. But in reality, we are experiencing a problem, because controlling water extraction is has not been that easy. In one hand, for instance, in the Valley of Mexico, you can have like 2,500 deep wells with a permit, but we know that there are more than 6,000 operating. And we know that if we stop that operation, we would cause a very big economic damage. So there has to be a shift and an improvement of our water administration system in terms of first achieving an effective control of water extraction and discharges, and second, perhaps allowing short-term reallocation of water as it exists, for instance, in southern United States. There are some other countries in the region where you don't have these water rights systems, and they are also experiencing these conflicts between different sectors. I think this is one of the biggest challenges, but also we have promising technologies that would help us with better measuring not only water cycle but also water uses. I don't know if I am, but definitely it will cause many conflicts before it arrives to a solution.
The water with energy and food. Some institutional challenges are.
Sorry, I just heard the final part of the question.
The interrelations among government levels as well as the horizontal exchange of management efforts with neighboring local authorities and not less upstream and downstream local administrations. This is so in your view, what is the role of technological changes in handling water deficits, both urban and rural areas? Another connected question again from Boris, like the previous one, is the main lesson is the response of population to management initiative by authorities. So what are the main lessons in this regard? So any comments or reactions from you?
Yes. Well, for instance, I think that technology is a solution whenever you have the means to make the investments, and not only the capital investments, but also to ensure that the operation and management costs will be also covered. So in some parts of our country, we have, talking about Mexico, we have had, for instance, desalination plants or water transfers, but it also has there is an inequality issue there, because some other regions, for instance, rural localities and some smaller cities are facing many problems, have intermittent water supply with low quality water. And for those cities, the income of the population and is not enough to think of technology as the only solution. So I think that we have to develop very rapidly real social capacities to deal with the problems we are facing. I mean, we have the similar problem or situation as it was mentioned for South Africa. We have watershed or basin councils that are more than of a consultative nature, but with very limited concrete capacities in terms of finance and in terms of decision. So we are going back to centralized structural supply-oriented measures, and we shouldn't be relying on that, because that will certainly lead us to big problems in the near future. And in terms of coordination between agencies, it's also a problem, because as I was telling you, the first big efforts made in the region were for agricultural and hydroelectrical projects. So these organizations became very powerful. But now we are going through a rapid transformation in terms of the energy production sector, and because it is going to other energy production technologies and to the private sector mainly. So there we are also experiencing some changes. In terms of agriculture, and talking also about Mexico Mexican experience, that is one of the areas where, more than climate change, we are having a very huge impact of globalization. I mean, whenever you find a market for a product, then in the other hand, you don't have an effective control of water extraction and discharges, and you have local high impacts. For instance, now we have this avocado demand, and we are experiencing very difficult problems in the regions of the country that produce this fruit. So I guess the lesson is that we have to very rapidly improve our measuring networks, our planning methods, but also our institutional frameworks in order to be able to respond to these growing conflicts between different water uses and between regions.
Okay, I have 3 or 4 questions. Let me begin with the very first one. That you have indicated getting water from external watersheds with much resistance from local stakeholders of the watersheds. What role would payment for ecosystem services play to solve this conflict? It's a question from Sostan from Southern Africa.
Well, I mentioned the water funds that are being supported also by the bank, but I have to be very honest with you in the sense that those I have seen can be helpful, but in terms of the size of the imbalance in some regions, and in terms of the needs of ensuring water supply in some others, there must we must have other measures also. But certainly, payment for watershed conservation is a very important issue. We have had some experiences that have been working very well in very local settings. I know some cases in Central America and South America, in Quito, for instance, in Ecuador, and here in Mexico, we have 2 or 3 examples where cities are collecting money to pay for watershed conservation. But it's an emerging trend, and I guess we need to have more sound numbers to demonstrate in what extent these measures are improving our water security, and in what extent we should also complement them with other measures.
Mentioned by David that some of the dams in Cape Town are operating at reduced capacity because of drought, less rain on the one hand, and higher levels of siltation on the other. They are filling up, and some of them are working only 10-15% capacity. We have a similar challenge in Pakistan. The larger reservoirs are at the lowest level, and siltation is very high. They are lowest level because of diminished rainfall. Do you have a similar pattern or experience in some of the countries that you referred to in your presentation in Latin America?
Yes, clearly. And that is because I guess one of the reasons is that not only that traditionally water supply has been linked only to the movement of water volumes and not to the land management, but also because what has been said before about jurisdictional limitations. So even, for instance, when we have in the national water laws, we have this adoption of integrated water resource management as a model. In the reality, our water authorities have limited capacities to deal with land and territorial management. Perhaps an interesting case is in Colombia, where you have these autonomous regional confederations that deal at the same time with water and with environment. But certainly we have to work also with controlling erosion and controlling land development, because we are losing very rapidly our capacity to store water in the dams.
Okay. In Cape Town's case, Ricardo, one more question. In Cape Town's case, resource management we learn is intensely political. So the decision making has become hostage to the competition or conflict or finger pointing between national, provincial, and local governments. More than action, it's a time for reflection for some of those governance structures. Experience in India and Pakistan from South Asia is not very different. I cannot say the same thing about China, that also has large dams and severe droughts and flooding issues at hand, where dozens of scores of cities in urban that are more than 5 million are facing a similar kind of challenge. So what is, in your view, that we have to learn from each other, and particularly from Latin America, to increase coordinated decision making between provincial, national, and local governments?
Well, that is a very tough issue, because not only in terms of water resource management, but also in terms of water supply, for instance, and even for agricultural, big development of agricultural systems, we have long-term needs that are related to the water cycle, that are related also to the capital-intensive system we have. I mean, we need infrastructure that should last 15, 20, 25 years. And in the other hand, some of the services are in the jurisdiction of local authorities that have only 3 or 4 years in charge. So there is, I think there is a natural, an inevitable tension between these two parts. But in the region, in the 90s and in the 80s, the last century, there were some efforts of developing long-term national water plans. And it seems to me that they worked somehow, perhaps because they were linked to construction programs, long-term construction programs. But we perhaps should think of having new long-term water plans related with non-structural and innovative financial and institutional measures. I don't know. It is a very big challenge in terms of that politicians are always trying to achieve short-term results and to be recognized for those results. But working in water issues means being patient. So it's a difficult question there.
I have 2 more questions. One is your favorite and one is mine. Which one should I ask first?
We'll go ahead with whenever.
Okay. Let me ask you my favorite question before I come to your favorite. My favorite question is that from the previous presentation about Cape Town, I learned that the infrastructural development fell behind the population growth rate. There was not sufficient infrastructure to provide sufficient water to the growing population and their consumption pattern. So there was a deficit of infrastructure to support urbanization or urban needs. And this is also our experience in Pakistan, where the infrastructure has lagged behind by many decades, and sometimes even half of the population of the cities do not have access to even drinking water. So the rationing that we are just seeing in Cape Town in many ways is not new for cities like Karachi or Quetta or others, or Islamabad. So question is, this kind of lag is an investment opportunity for multilateral banks such as the Latin American Development Bank or the Asian Development Bank or the World Bank. But that infrastructure adds to inequality in cities, and that's at the heart of crisis. So it seems that the governments will be tempted to have more infrastructure supported by multilateral institutions, but it'll add to inequality. since you work with many of them as consultant these days and previously much more engaged, so how do you get out of this vicious cycle of more and expensive infrastructure that adds to inequality?
Well, yes, that's a good question. Yes, well, we have been witnessing that in particular Latin American region has been investing much less than it should have been. But also there is a general trend in the world where I mean you could say that the cheap money is every day more scarce. So grants and donations are going to some other regions in the world. And for Latin America, we will have to go more and more for credits with repayable schemes. But I mean, the question of inequality is a very important one, because in the end, all these investments will impact on the income of the people. And as long, I mean, this is usually out of the scope of the water engineers, but we have to deal with that. As long as we are not achieving a more equal society, we are not becoming able to implement more expensive solutions. Somebody will have to pay for those solutions. So yes, economic equality should be the first goal for every country. Poverty reduction, perhaps, because from a financial point of view, it would be more, it would be desirable to go first for local funding. I mean, property taxes and so on, and leave to the final decision the external debt, because it also and I'm telling this as a consultant from a multilateral development bank, but this is like a thing of financial logic. You shouldn't take exchange risks if you can avoid them, no? But I guess that precisely our poverty and inequality problems are our main limitation in order to achieve a higher water security level. But once again, this normally is out of the scope of the water sanitation policymakers. I don't know if I'm addressing.
No, I think this is a very thoughtful response that you gave. It's a very complex question, of course. This is not an easy question. But if you allow me, I do wish to ask you a last question that has come from someone. And that's your favorite domain. You know from Mexico's experience that land use is central to some of these questions that we are talking about. And the management authorities in their initiatives and decision making are not always addressing the land use pattern and the changes in this. So the land use controls should play a central role as much as payment of environmental services. Is that correct? How would you respond to this kind of question?
Yes, that is correct. Land use control is instrumental, but I should also say that in many countries we have a very advanced land use regulations and policies, but we are lacking of law enforcement, effective law enforcement, and has to do perhaps with advancing in the political culture of the population and of the government in the region. I mean, it happens also with the water laws. We have very good laws, but we are losing, for instance, capacity of measuring the water cycle. So we have to work more in the field with concrete results and perhaps being less reliant on very big concepts. I mean, it's important to talk about human right to water, this kind of thing, but as long as we don't get to concrete measures in the field, we will be proposing, or we will be witnessing new proposals of new regulations in water and land use. I mean, the main issue, I think, is political culture and law enforcement in the region.
There are many questions I can see, but we really have to close this now because our time is up. I want to ask one question. The same question is for David, if he's still connected, as well as for you. David, are you there?
Yes.
Okay. The question, same question I want to ask both speakers is that the cities, how can cities preempt disasters by engaging with these complex issues of governance that you referred to? And these issues are within their remit and sometimes within their control. So what are the preemptive strategies or policies or investments the cities need to make? So let's begin with Cape Town before we go to Latin America.
I think the cities, we need to find a way for the cities to look beyond the cities in the South African case, where we need to find mechanisms that allow them to actually exercise influence. We do have a mechanism, the Catchment Management Agency, but we need to find ways to actually get that to have, I would say, at least executive power decision making. So I think we need to really get this intermediate level of governance of water going, but it has to be integrated. It has to integrate across natural resources, because it's important to ensure that our water quality and quantity is protected. And you can't do that without working together with the agencies that see over land management. And then I think we also need to have a bottom-up process, which is what I would call civil society, private sector, and so on, actually mobilizing to get government to work together with government to address this situation. That's my opinion in short.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Ricardo.
Yes, I agree with Dr. Lemaitre. I think this is more or less the same approach we should promote here. We have also these jurisdictional limitations, but as it was mentioned, not only the watershed committees or councils, but also there are different arrangements that are emerging where, for instance, private companies are creating funds to invest in improving efficiency in agriculture and in urban systems. So I guess that cities are the most prepared places to mobilize resources, not only money, but also knowledge, to help other users in the watersheds and to support other users in terms of what you were saying about the payment of environmental services, but also with concrete measures for improving efficiency and also to improve the measurement of hydrological and climatological variables, and to use better tools for deciding future water supply. I mean, we have to learn to think of the future in a different way, not as we usually did in the past for the water supply projects, but thinking of many scenarios, thinking of this kind of robust decision-making models, and we have to make an important shift in terms of the way we look from the cities, the water supply for the future.
Thank you. Thank you. Excellent answer and very thoughtful. I wish to thank both speakers. David Lemaitre as well as Ricardo Minaro. You have done an excellent job Thank you for your availability. Thank you for sharing your experience and insights. By way of summing up, I am struck with the similarities that exist in the challenge across the regions, in fact, across the continents. I think if you allow me in two sentences, one is that it's not always clear that which body is responsible to address the challenge. Oftentimes there is a discord and there is a finger pointing between the technical people and the political leadership and different tiers of political leadership at the city level and at the government, higher government levels. Second is because of growing inequality, higher and higher percentage of cities does not have 24/7 access to clean drinking water as and when they need, even in the minimum quantities that have come forward in terms of rationing in some cities recently. So the challenge is as the cities grow, how do they stay or become more livable, offer equity and fair chance to human dignity in various settings. And third is about infrastructure. I stand corrected that the dams in surrounding areas of Cape Town may not be filling because of silting, but otherwise they are across the regions. We know very well, but what we do need is that the infrastructure do need to keep pace with the growing population, and they also require climate proofing. And I think the final message that has come is very strong one, that the cities cannot be seen as standalone. They are intrinsically linked with hinterland, with the rural populations, and their ecological footprint has a strong bearing on rural life and settings as well. So they need to be seen as subservient to ecosystems, and such concepts as the payment for ecosystem services need to be explored further. These were some of the key points that I wanted to capture. Once again, I want to thank you both, and I also want to those who signed up and are there, and I want to apologize if I have not addressed many questions that I see on the screen. And thank you also those who are sitting here in this room attending to this very patiently. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for coming. I hope it was useful.